Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Hello and welcome to Psyched. Today we have quite a treat for you, a comedian named Rose Siskind. She has a show called Drug Test where she brings on influencers and world athletes to take psychedelics and perform rigorous exercise. She's been a head writer for Neil Degrasse Tyson's show StarTalk, a White House Correspondents' dinner writer, and most recently has been equipping our future robotic overlords with the Yiddish language so they can effectively fight anti-Semites the world over. Welcome to the show, Sarah. How are you doing?
I'm psyched to be here, and I bet I'm the only person who's ever going to make that joke.
Well, we're very psyched and excited to have you on. Why don't you start us off by just giving us a quick introduction into how you got involved in comedy?
Sure. Accidentally, like a lot of comedians, I was working in the news and I was extremely depressed. And so I started writing for a theater, for the Upright Citizens Brigade Theater. And they liked me, so they had me write for their house team. And then somebody watching me was a executive for Neil Degrasse Tyson's show StarTalk and had me on a trial period editing their scripts. That's the sort of like unfunny logistical way that I got into comedy. But emotionally, I got into comedy the way that every comedian does, which is my family is funnier than I am, and I try very hard to make them laugh. And I'm still trying very hard. If you ask any comedian who's the funniest person you know, it's usually an older brother or an older sister or something, never another comedian.
Well, to extend your comedy background, we want to ask a little bit about your background in psychedelics. And really where we want to start that conversation is we all have these memories of psychedelics playing a role in our childhoods. Maybe we were partaking in a DARE program, or, a teacher was scolding us for looking at drugs with a little bit of enticement. Is there a memory that you have where you thought that, wow, maybe psychedelics are something that I actually want to incorporate into my life? Maybe it was at a party to try them, or something like looking at blogs, something like that.
Two experiences come to mind. The first one was a bewildering conversation with my father, who's very conservative, but who believed in legalizing all drugs. And I remember just like saying over and over again, even heroin, even acid, like they were sort of the same thing. And just being in awe that these things, which in my head at the time were synonymous with evil, could be something somebody would talk about legalizing. That was my first impression. My second one, the first positive experience I had, I remember in middle school, I used to do this game with my friends where we would faint on purpose. If you hyperventilate and crouch and then stand up really fast and somebody grabs you from behind, you'll faint. If you sort of hold your hands to your chest. And we would do this for hours. And I remember just being so enthralled at the idea that you could change your mental state. Now, obviously that's not psychedelics, but it is an early psychonautic experience that got me interested in the ability to control your perception.
That's actually extremely interesting. I think that we've seen worlds of like holotropic breathing, and have recently been involved in some ice bath and sauna alterations that have opened us up to worlds beyond psychedelics in terms of altering mental states. But yeah, that's a really interesting way to get started.
When you say we, have you and Evan like merged into the same human?
We've become a single entity over time. It's one of those two heads, one body kind of a situation. I don't know if you recently have revisited Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It looks a little something like
that. Oh yeah, the guy in the shrubbery, got it.
Our first logo for Psyched is actually supposed to be the two of our heads coming together and opening up into an all-seeing
Oh my
eye.
God.
We'll send that your way sometime if you want some nightmares
I just can't wait
afterwards.
for by the end of this podcast, you guys are like speaking at the exact same time. Synchronizing,
in harmony, at a perfect third. So, I mean, to just jump right into it, in your mind, how do psychedelics inform comedy?
So I was thinking about this question, and I think it comes down to really one thesis statement, which is just that empathy improves comedy and comedy improves empathy. One of the ways of analyzing the question, how do psychedelics inform comedy, is to really do a deep dive into like what do psychedelics really mean? Why is the question not like, do drugs inform comedy? And my response to that would just be that psychedelics are fundamentally empathy enhancers. In my experience and sort of universalizing it, that would be a sort of close synonym I would create. So to get into the question, like, how does empathy improve comedy? When you have a better understanding of the thing you're parodying, it makes the parody deeper and more nuanced and interesting. I have a friend who had a show called The President Show where he played Donald Trump every night. It was on Comedy Central. It was like, got a 3-year run, I think. And it was pretty successful. And he did a very close impersonation of Donald Trump. But the interesting thing is when he was interviewed about it, like this very liberal, East Coast elite person had to develop a deep empathy for Donald Trump in order to do a good parody. And what he came up with was this sort of like sad, morose figure who actually didn't want to be president to begin with either. And so his parody is actually really realistic and nuanced and actually a lot funnier, because underneath all of the bombast and ridiculousness of Trump is a deep sadness. Like there's this scene where he's trying to like explore New York on some campaign, but he can't go up any of the ramps because he's too lazy, and he's just at the bottom of the ramp looking really sad. And honestly, if Anthony Attamniak, the actor, hadn't been able to master a really convincing, genuine look of sorrow, the parody wouldn't be quite as funny, because it does elicit some weird empathy that I think kind of delights people in a strange way. Many people would be hesitant to admit it that way. So I think that empathy improves comedy, and psychedelics are fundamentally empathy enhancers.
And upon your story of Donald Trump, I mean, so much of comedy, especially political comedy, plays with power structures. And I remember hearing that a lot of comedians, what they're trying to do today is be cognizant of making fun of the oppressor versus making fun of the oppressed. And using that as a way to really separate those two worlds and making sure that comedy doesn't turn into a tool for marginalizing specific communities. Do you feel there's a similar dynamic within psychedelics, in the world of psychedelics, in terms of power and control and the influence that these substances can have on our society?
It's a really, really good question. So I'm a much more a scholar of comedy. At least I've been in that field professionally longer than with psychedelics. And I can tell you there's a huge difference between punching up and punching down. That unlike with empathy and psychedelics, comedy really can be weaponized. It can be used as a distancing device, as a measure to put people down. That's sort of like comedy in the form of roasts or bullying, where the intention is to make somebody feel bad. There's a type of satire known as Juvenalian satire, which is satire with the express purpose of mocking something like very derisively. And sometimes that's necessary, but it's a really destructive force and should be used really wisely. I'm actually generally opposed to that in all circumstances, like even in the most dire ones. Like, for example, people often talk about people bring up Nazis as like the furthest extent of evil. And one of the things I think about is this TV show Hogan's Heroes, where the cast is actually a bunch of Nazis who are running a concentration camp. And it's a comedy in the 70s, not that long after the Holocaust. And the funny thing is the Nazis are all played by Jews who are like actually empathizing with these Nazis, you know, and their kind of hapless, a bit like inept ability to run a camp well. And it's crazy, but they managed to use empathy to make these Nazis look sort of like hapless fools. And so I think that it's possible to use empathy even when putting somebody down. That said, a lot of comedy can be just destructive. So that's the way that comedy can be destructive. Then the second part of your question was about whether psychedelics can sort of similarly punch up or punch down. That one is kind of an interesting way to think about it. I know that like the one thing I've seen is people who've been taking psychedelics for a short period of time, assuming that their leap of empathetic learning is bigger than it actually is. It's essentially saying like, I've had these experiences, I can universalize, I can empathize with anybody, and fundamentally closing them off to the idea that actually, no, there are a lot of things you have left to learn, and you need to show some humility when approaching different like marginalized communities. More specifically, it's sort of like a lot of people who listen to Joe Rogan, as much as I love Joe Rogan and his podcast, a lot of his fans, you know, take acid once and then think that they've experienced a massive empathetic revolution that excludes further learning, so that other people, they won't sort of humble themselves to learn about other people's experiences. It's the best way I can describe it. So that is a danger of psychedelics, is sort of this master of the universe superiority feeling I kind of see sometimes with recent devotees.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'd love to dig in a little bit to you know what it is that makes you bring up empathy as the bridge between psychedelics and comedy. Like what I'm hearing from what you're saying is that the use of psychedelics, either as a participant or a performer in the context of comedy, enhances either the performer's ability to create, you know, the idea of connection and empathy in the audience and, you know, some other, you know, group outside of the room that's being talked about in the set, or as a listener, you know, to develop that feeling through the experience of comedy. You know, as you're universalizing that, you know, what can we learn from how psychedelics increase empathy in the context of comedy and broaden that to a more societal level? Like what can that effect of increased empathy have?
Well, let me know if this answers your question. It's a personal story about how I first started exploring the intersection of comedy and psychedelics. I did an ayahuasca ceremony with an extremely well-respected shaman. And he started off the ceremony by giving an 1.5-hour speech that I promise you, I did not understand a half a sentence of his speech. It was English, but he would start a sentence and by the end I would just have no idea what he was saying. It was a lot of like, you know, the sacred geometry of the fractal resonance of the universe echoes within and throughout. And it just, it was all of this stuff. And I was like, I feel like I took an AP class and I am completely should be in the intro class. I jumped in way into the deep end. I should probably go. Flash forward to like 2 hours later when I've got the drugs in me. This speech makes total sense. And I understand everything he's saying, maybe better than he does. And so I go up to him and he's like surrounded by, you know, these devotees of his. And I just want to briefly talk to him. And I go up to him and I'm nervous because I don't know how to speak to him because he's Peruvian. He looks very serious. It's a very intense charged situation. And I go up to him and I said, you know, I have to tell you, when I got here and you were talking, I had no idea what you were talking about. And he looked at me and he just kind of said, you know what? Me neither. And it was so wonderful because I didn't think that this man, this guy who's from Peru, who comes from an ancestry of shamans, could have a sense of humor. But he did, and he spoke my language. I think he knew immediately comedy was the language that gets through to me. And he let me know that spirituality, even sacredness, doesn't have to always be serious. And that is the impression that it gets a lot, that psychedelics and spiritual experiences, which are related, are very serious situations involving gravitas and, silence. And sometimes they do, but sometimes laughter can be profound and you can learn from it.
Definitely. Beautiful story. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper as well into the humility aspect that you mentioned earlier. And really, so much of what we talk about with psychedelics and the positive consequences of psychedelics come with a routine of integration afterwards, and really being able to develop processes to step into empathy through the integration after a ceremony or an experience. Are there things that have worked for you in terms of taking an experience forward and being able to actually develop greater empathy?
You mean like integrating after a psychedelic experience?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, integration has always been tricky for me, frankly. It is something I'm sort of consciously trying to work on. And I have to say, like, for the people that find it harder, I actually record myself sometimes, like on my phone, on my just a microphone recorder, because I have a very strong compensation effect after I take psychedelics, where oftentimes the next day I'll say, oh my God, I was being so stupid last night and I'm so embarrassed. I feel like I said so many wrong things. But when I actually listen to myself, I'm amazed how much it holds up. So that's one thing that's just a tip that I give people. But in terms of like integrative experiences, I think that another thing is like you can't always control when the integration happens. Like it's great to have a talk with a therapist after an experience, or talk with friends, but sometimes the integration will kind of creep up on you when you aren't expecting it. And hopefully you're in a place where you can reflect on it. Like you're in a yoga place, or you can kind of meditate and reflect on the lessons. But that's another thing I've found, is that sometimes I'm still learning from psychedelic experiences I've had years ago, frankly.
When we are stepping into a psychedelic experience, a lot of my experiences have involved a super consciousness of the social dynamics in a room, and that in so many ways overlaps with comedy. Do you feel that there are some types of social dynamics that, when in a sober state or when under the influence of something like alcohol, really change in terms of their comedic value as opposed to when we are under the influence of psychedelics?
Oh yeah, I've long dreamed of trying to do like a tight five for a room full of people on psychedelics. Like essentially a stand-up routine that would only work if you were wearing the 3D goggle version of psychedelics. Like where it's like, this isn't funny, but then you put on your goggles and now it pops out and it's hilarious. Like I remember the best joke I ever told in high school was to a room full of high people on marijuana, and all I did was ask, "Do giraffes have Adam's apples?" And I killed that question somehow. Absolutely, absolutely killed. But no, I mean, like, I think that if I'm understanding your question correctly, that psychedelics do kind of affect how we perceive comedy, where like and social dynamics specifically. Like it's sort of like Seinfeld there's a type of Seinfeld humor, which is to say observational comedy, that works really well on psychedelics. Like I remember once theorizing to a friend while we were both on acid, isn't it strange that when you're on a boat, somehow just the magical transformative power of a boat makes it socially acceptable to wave to another person on a boat? That if I'm crossing the street, I don't just wave at another person on a sidewalk just because we're both on sidewalks. But if we're both on boats, then it's totally fine to wave. And we were kind of musing about this, about like how dumb it is to wave at another person, but also how gratifying it is. And what is it that you're communicating when you're both on boats? Like there's some, I think to some extent, even the most veteran salesman or like sailor or whatever they're called, clearly not me, when you're like waving to another person on a boat, you're implicitly saying, isn't this crazy? We're both on boats. And like that's somehow being communicated, like the absurdity of being able to, you know, stand on water. And that kind of observation, you have to have an altered mind to see something you've seen a million times and then to appreciate the absurdity of it.
You know, it's beautiful, you know, a moment ago when you brought up this idea of opening beyond seriousness. And in that case, you were talking about it in a spiritual context within psychedelics, but I think there's a broader societal conversation around, you know, what is it to develop a lightness of heart, and is that a worthwhile place to be in this post-survival world that we live in? And I think most people come to an answer, yes, you know, that this excessive heaviness and seriousness that most people walk through life with is a burden rather than an asset. And it got me thinking a bit about how, you know, in many ways psychedelics are an increase in receptivity. To take a psychedelic is to increase your neuroplasticity for a brief period of time and to be more receptive to an experience and to the imprints that that experience will give you. And, you know, it has me thinking that taking psychedelics in the context of experiencing comedy could be a really great asset in developing that lightness of heart, in the same way that, you know, taking a psychedelic in the context of therapy can really be profoundly effective in moving beyond trauma. You know, you're more receptive to that therapeutic environment. Do you have any thoughts about, you know, how those two can intersect in that way?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities between psychedelics and comedy after trauma, because I think they both under the influence of comedy and under the influence of psychedelics, it increases receptivity, as you put it. Like one of my old UCB teachers had this saying. He was a bartender, and so he'd always give us his little, you know, adages of wisdom in this like rough Boston accent, and he would say, you know, when it comes to trauma and comedy, the medicine goes where it hurts. And I always like that when you ask the question, like, can we really make fun of this? Like, isn't this too soon? Is this really an area where you can make a joke? And depending on how you craft the joke, it's really true that medicine goes where it hurts. And an example of this that I always think about is I was in school when I was actually at like very nearby the Boston Marathon bombs. I was about a block away, and I was pretty shooken up by the experience. And I remember, weirdly enough, turning to late night, and I was watching Stephen Colbert have to do his show after a terrorist attack has just happened. And he decided that he wanted to talk about the people of Boston and how strong they are. And he said, you know, these terrorists don't know who they're messing with. These Bostonians are a people founded by pilgrims who are so intense they had to buckle their hats on. And I remember just like laughing so intensely at that, because it was such a needed release, and it was exactly what it's supposed to do. It's building up a people. It's not punching down. You know, it's not saying anything about, you know, it's not even frankly punching down at the terrorists. It's building up a people, and there's nothing more cathartic than that. And there's somehow, I've always called laughter a backdoor into consciousness, because even the most stubborn people can laugh at a joke from an opposing viewpoint if the joke is good enough, and the logic will sometimes seep in.
Beautiful. Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Really happy to have had you on the show tonight, Sarah, and really just happy to have gained whatever insight we can about the intersection of comedy and psychedelics.
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks again, Sarah. And next time we'll be exploring more questions like, do giraffes have Adam's apples?
All right, that's all, folks.
You know what? The world needs to know. I don't know if we're ready, but we need to know.
Sure.